Russia has stepped up its claim that Ukraine is preparing to detonate a radioactive device on its own territory and possibly blame it on Moscow. So the so-called dirty bomb uses conventional explosives to spread radioactive material into the air and contaminate the surrounding area. The weapon has never been used before. The Russian defense minister made those allegations yesterday. Ukraine and Washington have rejected the allegations as a false flag. Meanwhile, Russian airstrikes have caused serious damage in a southern city near the area where Ukraine's army is gearing up for a likely major offensive. So Holly Williams is following all the latest developments in the war in Ukraine. Holly is joining us now. And we're going to start off with these claims of a dirty bomb that Ukraine is planning to use on its own people and then point the finger at Russia.
The extraordinary claim that Ukraine could detonate a radioactive device on its own territory, an allegation with apparently no evidence to back it up that's been dismissed as false by the US. Meanwhile, here in Ukraine, it's instead sparked fears that Russia could itself be about to use a radioactive weapon. In a phone call yesterday, Russia says its defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, told Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin that Ukraine could be preparing a so-called dirty bomb. A dirty bomb has never been used before, is not a nuclear explosion and would be far less harmful. But by using conventional explosives to spread radioactive material, it's an effective weapon of terror and could contaminate an area for years. In a joint statement, the US, the UK and France rejected Russia's transparently false allegations, saying the world would see through any attempt to use it as a pretext for escalation. If Russia claims Ukraine's preparing something, it means one thing, said Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, suggesting it's actually Russia that plans to use a dirty bomb. The US has repeatedly accused Russia of disinformation and so-called false flag operations in Ukraine, staging violent incidents as an excuse for its brutal invasion.
All of these are consistent with the playbook the Russians have used before, to set up a false justification to act against Ukraine.
And in reality, it's Vladimir Putin who's threatened to use nuclear weapons. The Ukrainian energy minister told us that in this country, they believe him. Do you think it's possible that Vladimir Putin will use a tactical nuclear weapon here in Ukraine?
I think he'll do everything. I am expected from them now everything.
Russia's warning that the situation in Ukraine is trending towards, quote, uncontrolled escalation. In truth, though, Russian forces appear to be under pressure. They've rapidly lost territory and they recently switched tactics, targeting Ukraine's power grid. Anne-Marie.
Holly, let's talk a little bit more about this idea of a dirty bomb. It's not the first time that Russia has been accused of using a false flag sort of strategy. I'm thinking about it in Syria, something similar. How devastating would something like this be?
So my understanding, Anne-Marie, is that would depend entirely on how much radioactive material was actually in the dirty bomb and also how much explosive material there was in the bomb. It's clear that this would be nowhere near as devastating, nowhere near as harmful as a nuclear bomb, but it would be pretty terrifying if it went off in your city or on the block of your city. And it would also, because of contamination, potentially deny your enemy access to that area for a period of time, perhaps months, perhaps years, until it was cleaned up. Interestingly, until now, when dirty bombs have been discussed, it's generally been in reference to terrorist groups. It's been thought that a terrorist group might use a dirty bomb, not a nation state.
And then how are Ukrainians responding to this threat?
Well, they're making it clear that they think it's possible or even extremely likely that this is a so-called false flag operation by the Russians. That is where the Russians stage an incident or even carry out a violent attack and then blame it on the Ukrainians. We heard from the Ukrainian foreign minister who said that Russia's allegations were lies, absurd as they are dangerous.
All right, now onto one of the annexed areas, Kherson. Russia has installed sort of its own officials to kind of run Kherson. They have offered to evacuate civilians, except they have to evacuate to Russia. What more do we know about what's happening there?
Well, they've actually now ordered civilians from that area to evacuate away from the front line ahead of an expected Ukrainian counteroffensive, because we know the Ukrainians are taking more and more territory back from the Russians. There have been reports that the Russian military has actually begun withdrawing from that area, but we can't confirm that at this point. It's not official as far as we know. And then the Ukrainians are also claiming that the Russians could be planning to blow up a massive hydroelectric dam in that area. And they're saying that the Russians have actually already laid the mines to do so. Now, we cannot independently confirm that allegation, but the Ukrainians are saying if that actually happened, if the Russians blew the dam, it would impact hundreds of thousands of people, and it could even leave a nuclear power plant without water for cooling.
It has now been 8 months since the fighting began. I'm curious about what has been like for your own reporting. When I think about it right now, it almost seems like we are back to where we were in the beginning, reporting on mass evacuations and a shifting front line or a blurred front line. Where exactly is it? Is it in Kyiv? Is it, along these annexed areas? How has your reporting evolved and shifted over the course of the war?
It's really interesting you say that, Anne-Marie, because from my perspective, things now, although there's still this obviously very clear threat to Ukraine, they have Russian invaders in their country, things are really different. When I was here at the start of the invasion, the Ukrainians never panicked. That doesn't seem to be something that they do very easily. But there was such tension when the Russians first arrived in the country. Suddenly, the country was kind of mobilizing to head off this invasion. There were checkpoints suddenly on roads everywhere. Outsiders were sometimes treated with suspicion. And that included us. Now, fast forward 8 months, the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back from around the capital, Kyiv. They've retaken swaths of territory in the northeast and the south. And Ukrainians these days aren't just determined, they seem extremely confident. And certainly every Ukrainian that I've discussed this with says, as a certainty, we are going to win this war.
Oh, that is so interesting, Holly. Thank you very much.